I told him that he was a weak man and should watch me doing it with his friend. He stood up and then,
Hey Reddit. First of all, not my first time posting here, but I'm using a throwaway account because I really don't want this tied to my main. You know how it is when you're airing out your personal life. No need for everyone to connect the dots. For the sake of privacy, I'm going to call myself Emma and my husband Ray. So, a little background. I'm a 29-year-old woman, and Ray, my husband, is 28. We've known each other for what feels like forever, actually since high school. We met when I was 17 and he was 16, and it was like this immediate connection. You hear people say love at first sight a lot, and for Ray, it was exactly that. He was head over heels for me from the moment we met. Honestly, it was almost overwhelming at first. The way he looked at me, the way he hung on my every word. But slowly, I fell for him too, and we've been together ever since. We dated all through high school and into college. It was never even a question of us breaking up or growing apart like you hear about with other couples. We just always knew we were meant to be together. Everyone called us the couple. You know, the ones everyone assumes are going to end up married, have kids, the whole thing. And they weren't wrong. Ray proposed to me about 3 years ago, and we got married 2 years ago. Since then, life has been good. At least I thought so. Ray has always been the romantic one in our relationship. He's the guy who brings home flowers randomly, the one who plans date nights, and the one who always asks if I need anything, whether it's a cup of coffee in the morning or a shoulder to lean on when things are tough. He's the type of husband who's always there, and I never had to worry about him not showing up for me. He loves me to bits, and trust me, I know it. Ray's the type of man who would bend over backward for me without thinking twice. I'm serious. He wouldn't even hesitate. Whether it's something small like changing plans last minute because I don't feel like going out, or something bigger like taking on extra shifts to pay for that vacation I wanted. He's always been the one making the sacrifices in this relationship, and honestly, I've always been okay with that. Here's the thing though, I'm not exactly *that* romantic. Sure, I love him too, but I've always been more of the laid-back one in our relationship. Ray's the one who does the grand gestures, and I've never really felt the need to match that level of effort. He just does it because he loves me, and I appreciate it. I've never had to work hard to keep him happy or make him feel special because he's always the one doing it for both of us. I'm a stay-at-home wife, which is something Ray and I both agreed on when we got married. I know some people might raise an eyebrow at that, but it works for us. Ray's always been a hard worker, and he's been providing for us since the beginning. He loves his job, and he's proud to be the breadwinner. I, on the other hand, take care of the house and everything that comes with it. Honestly, I've been perfectly happy with the way things have been. I get to live a comfortable life, and Ray gets to play the role he's always loved, provider and protector. I guess the thing is, though, sometimes I may have taken that for granted. The issue is, Ray has always been a little too weak, in my opinion. I know that sounds harsh, but if I'm being honest here, that's just how I've always seen him. He's not your typical guy, you know? Not the kind of man that commands a room or oozes confidence. He's never been the type to take charge or stand up for himself, at least not in the way I would have expected from a normal man. I guess that's something I started noticing more after we got married. When we first met, I thought it was cute that he was more on the nerdy side. He wasn't like the jocks or the bad boys most girls swoon over. Ray was different. He was sweet, quiet, thoughtful. But as time went on, that softness started to feel less like a positive trait and more like weakness. I'm not trying to shit on him, to be honest. I know it sounds bad, but it's the truth. Ray's always been more into things like comic books, video games, and board games with his friends than anything else. He's the kind of guy who would rather spend his Saturday night watching a new Marvel movie than, say, going out and partying or doing something more manly or adventurous. He's not the type to get his hands dirty with car repairs or have some big group of friends that he's the life of the party with. He's more of a loner, kind of introverted, and more interested in tech and gadgets than in sports or the typical guy stuff. And that's okay, I guess. It's who he is. But as we settled into our marriage, I found myself getting a little frustrated with it. It's like I wanted him to be stronger somehow, to have a bit more edge, I wanted him to be more assertive, to take control of things sometimes, but that just wasn't who he was. Ray's always been more of a people pleaser, especially with me. He never wanted to argue or push back, even if I was being unreasonable. He'd always just go along with whatever I said, trying to make me happy. After a while, I think I started seeing that as a kind of weakness. He wasn't like other men I saw, the ones who could stand their ground or handle things with a little more grit. Instead, he was this overly accommodating, soft-hearted guy who just wanted to make sure I was okay all the time. And maybe it's because of that I fell into the habit of mocking him for it. It wasn't intentional at first. It started out as playful teasing. You know, making fun of him for spending hours setting up his Dungeons & Dragons campaigns with his friends, or calling him a nerd when he'd get overly excited about some new tech gadget he bought. I thought it was harmless, just some banter between us. But looking back, I can see how that teasing turned into something more toxic. I started making little digs at him more and more, both in private and sometimes even in front of other people. It became a habit. Like if he couldn't open a jar, or if something broke around the house, I'd laugh and say something like, "Oh, don't worry, I'll take care of it, since you're not exactly Mr. Fix-It, are you?" Or if he hesitated about making a decision, I'd roll my eyes and be like, "Come on, Ray, you're such a pushover sometimes." I didn't really mean it in a hurtful way, or at least I didn't think I did at the time, but the more I said it, the more I realized it was eroding his confidence little by little. The worst part, I wasn't just doing it in private. I started making fun of him in front of our friends too. If we were hanging out and someone brought up something physical, like sports or fixing cars, I'd chime in with something like, "Yeah, Ray wouldn't know the first thing about that," and laugh it off like it was no big deal. The thing is, Ray would just laugh along, like it didn't bother him. But I could see it in his eyes. It did bother him. It hurt him. But I didn't stop. I guess, in a weird way, I thought it was fine because he loved me so much. I honestly didn't think it would push him away. I figured he'd never leave me no matter what I said or did. He was so in love with me that he would just take it, right? I was the one who held the power in our relationship, and I knew it. Ray was always the one bending over backward to make sure I was happy, and I guess I got a little too comfortable with that. It's not like I was outright cruel to him. At least I didn't think so at the time. But I can see now that I wasn't exactly being the best partner either. I was poking at his insecurities, and I did it so often that it became normal to me. I stopped seeing him as this strong, capable man, and instead I just saw him as someone who was always there to cater to my needs. And that's something I took advantage of. Now that I'm looking back on it, I realize that I've been pushing him down for years, and at the time, I thought he'd just keep taking it because he loved me. But, well, I guess love has its limits. Honestly, I'm even surprised that Ray didn't get tired of me sooner. Looking back now, I realize how much I shit on him for just about everything. And when I say everything, I mean it. Nothing was off limits. His sensitivity, the way he'd worry about his job, his physical appearance, his interests, his hobbies, all of it became fair game for my mockery. I'd pick at him for being too sensitive, always quick to get emotional or stressed out over little things. I'd say things like, "God, Ray, why do you have to be so dramatic all the time?" Or, "You worry too much, just man up." His job was another thing I'd constantly criticize him about. He works in cybersecurity, which I guess is a perfectly respectable job, but it's not the kind of job you associate with manly men, if you know what I mean. He would sometimes talk about how tough things were at work, or how stressed he was about his company restructuring or laying people off. And instead of supporting him, I'd dismiss his worries, telling him to stop whining or making sarcastic comments like, "Oh, poor Ray, stressed out because of his computer job, must be so tough sitting at a desk all day." Then there were his physical insecurities. Ray's always been on the thinner side, not exactly the muscular, athletic type. I mean, I don't mind it now, but at some point I started using that as ammunition too. I'd make little digs about how he wasn't as built as other guys, or joke that he'd never be able to lift me if I fell or something. I once even said something like, "Maybe you should hit the gym with Mike. He might teach you a thing or two about looking like a man." And I said that in front of Mike, by the way, one of Ray's friends who's built like a linebacker. Ray just laughed it off at the time, but I knew it stung. His preferences and interests were another target for my constant teasing. Ray's hobbies are pretty geeky, I guess. He's into things like gaming, reading fantasy novels, watching anime, and of course his beloved Dungeons and Dragons nights with his friends. I never really had an issue with that stuff when we first got together, but as time went on, I found myself getting annoyed by how into it he was. It wasn't manly in the traditional sense. It wasn't the kind of stuff you picture a guy obsessing over. I started making fun of it more and more. Every time he'd mention something about a new game or an episode he watched, I'd roll my eyes and say, "Oh, here we go again, nerd alert," or, "Why don't you grow up and do something that actually matters for once?" He'd just laugh it off as usual, but I knew I was cutting deep. I could see it in his face. He'd shrink a little every time I said something, but he never fought back. He just took it. What made it worse, though, was how I did this everywhere. Literally everywhere. I didn't just keep these jabs and insults behind closed doors. No, I did it in front of his friends, in front of my friends, at social events, at parties, anywhere. I had this nasty habit of embarrassing him publicly, but it wasn't even something I was fully aware of at the time. I just thought I was being funny or sarcastic, but it was cruel. There were plenty of times when we'd be out with friends, and I'd make some comment like, "Oh, Ray, he doesn't even know how to change a tire. I'm the one who had to call roadside assistance last time." Or, "Yeah, Ray would totally crumble if he had to deal with the kind of pressure your husband deals with, Sarah. You're so lucky you have a real man at home." The worst part is, I'd say this stuff to my girlfriends, in front of Ray, without even batting an eye. I didn't stop to think about how humiliating that must have been for him, sitting there while I compared him to other guys who were more manly or more capable in my eyes. It's not like Ray didn't notice. He noticed. I could see it on his face every time I said something that cut him down. But as usual, he didn't say anything. He would just sit there, smile politely, and laugh along like it didn't hurt him. But it did. I could see it, and yet I kept doing it. At the time, I didn't think much of it. In my mind, I was just teasing him. But now I realized that I was belittling him constantly, whether it was intentional or not. The thing is, I thought I had Ray wrapped around my finger. I never imagined he'd leave or get fed up with me. I thought his love for me would always be enough to keep him around, no matter how much I pushed him or mocked him. I figured, hey, he loves me, right? He'll take whatever I throw at him because he's too weak to leave me. But I was wrong. I'm still shocked that he stuck around for as long as he did, considering how often I tore him down. I mean, what kind of person does that to someone who loves them so much? Someone who would do anything for them? But I guess, in my mind, I had convinced myself that it was okay because I didn't really think of Ray as strong enough to leave me. I thought his weakness would keep him by my side forever. I started to notice that Ray was acting kind of distant. At first, it was subtle, small things that I didn't really think much of. He wasn't as talkative as he used to be, and when we were home together, he seemed distracted. He'd sit on his phone more often, scroll through social media or watch videos, and barely engage in conversation unless I started it. I remember thinking it was just work stress, or maybe something was going on with his friends that he didn't feel like discussing. But as time went on, it became more obvious that something was off. Ray started coming home later than usual. He would give me a quick kiss when he got home, say he was tired, and go straight to the shower or head to bed. Before, we used to have long conversations after work, talk about our day, and even sit down to watch a show or two together. Now, it felt like he was making excuses to avoid spending time with me. He'd say he was exhausted or he had some late-night work to catch up on, and I just shrugged it off. At the time, I didn't really think anything of it. I didn't even comprehend that Ray, the man who had always loved me so deeply, could possibly be avoiding me on purpose. The idea of him intentionally distancing himself from me was so foreign that it didn't even cross my mind. After all, this was Ray, the guy who had been obsessed with me since high school, the one who would do anything for me, no matter what. So instead of assuming that there was a problem between us, I thought it had to be something else. Maybe he was going through a rough patch at work, or he was stressed about something he didn't feel like sharing. I never thought that I might be the reason for his sudden change in behavior. In fact, I didn't give it much thought at all. I figured whatever it was, he'd tell me when he was ready. Ray wasn't the type to keep secrets from me, at least not that I thought. So I just left it at that, didn't push, didn't ask too many questions. I was comfortable in the belief that whatever was going on, it wasn't about us. It couldn't be. Ray loved me too much, and in my mind, there was no way he'd ever distance himself from me. It was almost like I had this blind confidence in our relationship. I had convinced myself that no matter what I said or did, Ray would always be there, waiting for me with open arms. So, even when he was becoming more and more withdrawn, I still didn't connect the dots. I didn't think it had anything to do with how I treated him, or the constant mocking. That wasn't even a possibility in my head. In fact, when I noticed he was being distant, I would sometimes joke about it, teasing him with things like, "What's wrong, Ray? You're not falling out of love with me, are you?" Or, "You're so quiet lately. Don't tell me you've got another woman." I said it all playfully, of course, not even realizing how out of touch I was with the reality of what was happening. Looking back now, it's painfully obvious that Ray was going out of his way to avoid me. He wasn't just tired or stressed. He was tired of me. The small cracks in our relationship were starting to show, and I didn't see them at all. I didn't recognize the signs that he was pulling away because, in my head, I was still in control. I believed that no matter how much I mocked him or belittled him, Ray would never leave me or even think about putting distance between us. And that's where I was so wrong. I underestimated him. I underestimated his strength, his feelings, and how much my behavior was affecting him. But back then, I didn't see any of that. I was too wrapped up in my own world, too sure of my own power over him, to even imagine that Ray, sweet, devoted Ray, could be slipping away from me. So instead of addressing it or trying to understand what was really happening, I just ignored it. I assumed everything would go back to normal on its own, that whatever was bothering him would pass. I thought, it's Ray. He's always been there, and he always will be. I had no idea that his distance was a warning sign, that things were starting to unravel, and by the time I realized it, it was already too late. Well, everything came to a head at a friend's birthday party. It started off like any other celebration: good food, drinks, laughter, and everyone in high spirits. After the official party wrapped up, a few of us decided to continue the night and head to a bar for more drinks. Ray and I were there with a few of our close friends, and as usual, after a few too many drinks, I let my guard down and started running my mouth. You know how alcohol works? It amplifies everything. And for me, it amplified my tendency to mock Ray. I started laying into him, just like I always did, without thinking twice about it. At first, it was playful jabs, laughing with my friends about how Ray was always so sensitive and nerdy. They laughed too, probably because they didn't know what else to do, but I didn't care. I just kept going, letting the alcohol loosen my tongue. I told them, in a half-joking, half-serious way, that Ray was so weak he wouldn't even do anything if he caught me with another man. I said, Ray's the type of guy who'd probably just watch from the corner and do nothing. I didn't even notice how quiet he had become, sitting there in the booth, staring into his drink. I was too caught up in the attention, in getting those cheap laughs from my friends. They chuckled awkwardly, probably uncomfortable, but I didn't stop. I kept mocking him, calling him weak, saying that he wasn't like the other men in our group. He wasn't manly enough, not in the traditional sense. Then, out of nowhere, Ray stood up, and I'll never forget the look on his face. It wasn't the soft, adoring look I had grown so used to over the years. It was a mix of anger and exhaustion, like he had been holding back for too long and had finally reached his breaking point. His voice cut through the noise of the bar when he told me to shut up. I remember freezing in my seat, the smile dropping off my face instantly. I had never heard him speak to me like that. It was so out of character for him to raise his voice, and for a second, I thought he was just messing with me. But then he said it. He was done with me. He said he couldn't take my constant mocking anymore, that he was sick of being humiliated and belittled. He told me that it was pathetic how I would call him weak when I was the one who depended on him for everything. His voice was firm, full of conviction, and it hit me like a slap in the face. I could feel the eyes of our friends on me, and the air around us became thick with tension. Nobody said a word as Ray went on, telling me that he wanted a divorce, that he was done with being treated like he was nothing. I was too stunned to respond. I just sat there speechless as he walked out of the bar. But before he left, he turned around, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a crumpled set of divorce papers. Divorce papers. I didn't even know they existed, let alone that they'd been sitting in our car all night. He threw them on the table in front of me and walked out without another word, leaving me there in complete shock. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The laughter that had filled the night disappeared, and all of a sudden I sobered up. I could feel the awkwardness settling over the table, the silence stretching out for what felt like hours. My friends were quiet, no one knowing what to say or how to react. I didn't know what to say either. I had never seen Ray like that, so strong, so decisive. I had always thought he was too soft to stand up to me, too in love with me to ever leave. But here he was, walking out of my life like he had been planning this for a long time. I tried to call him immediately after he left, my fingers fumbling with my phone. He didn't pick up. I tried again and again, but it went straight to voicemail every time. That's when I knew he was serious, dead serious. I didn't know what else to do, so I called an Uber and sat in the back seat the whole ride home, replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. It felt like the ground had just fallen out from under me. When I got home, things got even worse. My stuff, clothes, shoes, bags, everything was out on the porch. I couldn't believe it. Ray had actually thrown all my things out of the house. He'd locked the door, and no matter how hard I banged on it, no matter how many times I called his name, he wouldn't open up. I knew he was in there. I could see the light through the windows, but he didn't respond. It was like I didn't exist to him anymore. I was stranded. I didn't have anywhere else to go. He had even cleared out our joint account, leaving me with nothing. The money I used to pay for the Uber was the last bit of cash I had. I had to call my best friend, crying and begging her to let me stay at her place. She agreed, of course, but I could tell she was just as shocked as I was. Ray had always been the dependable one, the one who would never do something like this. But now, it felt like he had turned into a stranger overnight. It's been days now, and he still won't talk to me. I've sent him text after text, begging him to forgive me, to at least talk to me so we can work things out. I've apologized over and over, but he hasn't responded to a single message. I'm completely lost. I don't know what to do. I never thought Ray would leave me. I never thought he had it in him to walk away. And now, I'm stuck here, alone, with no idea what to do next. Update. Hey Reddit. Wow, the hate. A lot of people keep saying that I fucked around and found out, which honestly is just super annoying at this point. Like, yeah, I get it. I know I screwed up. Yes, I fucked around, and yes, I found out. Trust me, no one is more aware of that than I am right now. But can we move past that, please? I came on here genuinely looking for advice, not to get mocked into oblivion. I understand that I'm at fault. I've admitted that. I know I messed up in a big way, but I didn't come here to get roasted. I came because I need actual advice, something useful that might help me salvage my relationship and my marriage before it's too late. Because as of right now, my husband is literally on the verge of divorcing me, and I don't know what else to do. I've tried everything I can think of. I've already apologized more times than I can count, but that doesn't seem to be enough. My best friend has talked to me. My parents have gotten involved, even his parents. Though honestly, they seemed way too happy about the fact that Ray's divorcing me. They weren't exactly eager to help, if you know what I mean. Almost like they've been waiting for this to happen. Anyway, I've tried talking to Ray. I finally managed to get him to sit down and have an actual conversation with me, but he's not willing to budge on anything. He told me straight up that he wants a divorce and that nothing is going to change his mind. I could bring in the Pope, the Vatican, hell, I could resurrect a saint, and he wouldn't change his mind. I think he even joked about it, to be honest, which just made me feel even worse. How do I fix this when he's being so stubborn? It's like this whole situation started over something that I thought was a joke, something that he even laughed about before. I'm so annoyed and frustrated that everything has escalated to this point. I never thought Ray would actually leave me. I thought we'd just argue and get over it, like we always did. But this time, it feels like he's really done. And that realization is making me feel completely numb. I don't know what to do next. My friend, who has been amazing by the way, has let me stay with her, but I can tell I'm wearing out my welcome. She hasn't said anything, but I can feel the shift. She's tired of my situation, and honestly, I don't blame her. She keeps hinting that I need to figure something out soon, and I'm terrified she's going to kick me out soon because she's got her own life to deal with. I can't depend on her forever. So yeah, I'm at a loss. I don't know what to do. I'm desperate to fix this, but no matter what I try, Ray just won't listen. He won't even entertain the idea of reconciliation. I feel like I'm running out of time and my life is spiraling out of control faster than I can handle. Please, I'm begging you. If you have any actual advice, not just you fucked around and found out comments, I'd appreciate it more than you know. I need help. I don't know what else to do, and I feel like I'm running out of options. I've hit rock bottom, and I'm just trying to figure out how to climb out of this hole I've dug myself into. So, Reddit, please, what do I do now? Update. Hey Reddit, it's been a while since my last update, and honestly, that's because I've been really busy, just not in a good way. Life has been pretty much a mess since everything went down with Ray. After my last post, I had to move out of my friend's place. We ended up getting into a fight, and she just kept going on about how I was at fault for everything and how I deserved the fact that Ray was divorcing me. It got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore, so I left. Don't get me wrong, I still appreciate everything she did for me. She gave me a place to stay when I had nowhere else to go, but after that argument, I couldn't stick around. It was too much, and I didn't need someone constantly reminding me that I messed up. I already know that. Now I'm back at my parents' house, which has been, well, it's been something. I've spent most of my time just wallowing in my misery, if you get what I mean. It feels like I'm stuck in this endless cycle of regret and sadness, and it's exhausting. To top it off, I got served with divorce papers so fast. Like, I don't understand how it happened so quickly. The fact that Ray had those papers ready to go makes me think that he must have been planning this for a while. And now that I look back, it's obvious that he'd been pulling away for some time. I can't help but wonder, if the incident at the bar hadn't happened, would he still have given me those divorce papers? Or would he have changed his mind if I'd done a complete 180 and really worked on my attitude? I mean, I've had a lot of time to think about it, and I regret everything. Every single moment where I belittled him or didn't take him seriously. But now it's too late, and everything is moving so quickly. It feels like my entire life is spiraling out of control, and I don't know what to do. Being at my parents' house is no picnic either. They're constantly reminding me that I deserve what's happening. Every day, it's like I'm being hit with a new wave of judgment. They keep telling me how I brought this on myself, and honestly, I'm just so tired of hearing it. I already know I made mistakes, but it feels like everyone is against me. I can't catch a break. It's like no matter where I turn, I'm met with judgment and reminders of how badly I screwed up. And while I understand why people are saying that, because let's be real, I did this to myself, it doesn't make it any easier to deal with. I'm trying to figure out how to move forward, but it feels impossible when I'm constantly being reminded of my failures. I don't know what to do anymore. Ray is moving on with this divorce, and I'm stuck here, feeling like my entire world is collapsing around me. I'm tired, frustrated, and honestly just overwhelmed. Everyone seems to think that I deserve this, and maybe they're right. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm still trying to figure out what comes next for me. Anyway, that's where I'm at right now. Things are still a mess, and I'm trying to navigate through it. It feels like everything is happening so fast, and I'm just scrambling to keep up. If anyone has any advice, real advice, not just more judgment, I could really use it right now. I'm just trying to find some sort of direction in all this chaos. Update. It's been a long while since my last update. If you're just stumbling upon this post, feel free to check my post history for some context on everything that's happened. Honestly, I stopped updating for a bit because I was just tired. What's the point of sharing when everyone seems to hate me? All I've seen in the comments is how I deserved this, how it's all my fault, and even people saying they're happy Ray is divorcing me. It's been overwhelming, and I just didn't want to keep exposing myself to that negativity. But I feel like I owe you all a final update, a way to say goodbye to this chapter in my life. So here I am, updating for the last time. First off, I'm still at my parents' house. If you noticed, it's been months since I last posted, and the divorce has been finalized. It all moved so quickly. Honestly, it felt like we were just waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger on it. The process was swift, and I ended up with nothing. We'd only been married for a short time. No kids, no debts to split. Everything was his, and nothing was mine. I managed to keep a few items of sentimental value, but in terms of financial stability, I'm completely broke. Now, I'm divorced and a complete mess. I've sunk into a deep depression, and I miss my husband more than I ever thought I would. I regret everything. The weight of my actions feels unbearable, and I constantly replay moments in my head, wishing I could go back and change how I treated him. To make matters worse, I've lost about 90% of my friends. They all chose Ray's side, which only adds to my sense of isolation. I keep thinking about how I could have been better, how I failed him, and how I wish I had never made those jokes or mocked him. Ray wasn't weak. He was stronger than I could have ever realized. It's painful to accept that I pushed him away. I doubt I'll update again because the comments here can be brutal. Some made me laugh, but most just brought me to tears and forced me to reevaluate my situation. It's hard to admit, but maybe I deserve some of that criticism, so that's where I'm at. I'm not sure what the future holds for me, but I needed to share this final update as I close this chapter. Thank you to those who offered support along the way, even if it was hard to hear. I wish things had turned out differently. I never thought it would come to this. I never knew that what I was doing was so wrong, and that he saw things that way, and now my husband has left me. He left because I constantly reminded him of his mistakes and my sacrifices. He felt undervalued and left. And that's not even the whole reason why he left. I also cheated on my husband that I've been married to for 10 years, and he found out. Hey Reddit, I'm Emily, a 34-year-old lady who grew up in a small town with my parents and was always dreaming of bigger things and grand adventures. My life was pretty much a normal routine. I mean the normal daily, everyday life of every teenage girl. Until John walked into the picture. We met at a local cafe, reaching out for the same book on a shelf. It was a classic meet cute. John was charming with a smile that could light up the room. He had this charisma, and I was instantly drawn to him. Growing up with my parents, I spent a lot of time in the fields near my home imagining myself as an explorer. I always had my journal with me, sketching things around and writing down my dreams. My parents were business-oriented, always reminding me of the importance of stability. This sometimes made me feel unsure between staying safe and exploring more. When I wasn't exploring, I was helping out at my family's small bookstore. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in books. One rainy afternoon, John walked into the bookstore, looking for shelter from the storm. He was soaked, but his eyes sparkled with curiosity. When we both reached for the same book, our hands brushed and we laughed. That was how our story began. We couldn't deny the connection we had from our first meeting. I remember that we sat for hours talking about a book we both loved. It felt great to have something in common, especially our interest in books. Our chat covered everything from the characters to the story's themes, and time just flew by. And then he asked for my contact information, which I gave to him because it seemed like the right thing to do. John and I started texting, and I actually got to know him better. John was a really cool guy, just as I thought. His parents had moved to our town because they wanted to find a stable place for the family, and our town was pretty much the most stable place I know. He had dreams of becoming a writer, and my own dream was to become a journalist, so we usually had a lot to discuss or argue about. There was no dull moment with us at all, and I knew I liked John a little more than friendship. But I couldn't tell John because I knew he might not feel the same way about a girl he just met from a small town. And I also didn't want to lose our friendship if he didn't feel the same way, so I kept quiet about my feelings for him. I went to the college close to our town so I wouldn't be far from home. I loved our town, and I didn't want to ever leave, so I chose the college closer to home. I went to college from home every day. John left for another college, though we kept in touch and we were always telling each other about our experiences in college. In my second year in college, John confessed his feelings to me and asked me to be his girlfriend. And I was so happy and said yes. Each of our families knew we were together and they were both happy for us. We dated throughout college, and eventually, when we graduated, John got an opportunity to go for training in another state 1,000,000 miles away from home. It was a program for a year, and it was a really great opportunity for him to improve his writing and also be able to publish his work. And I was so sad then, and I couldn't bear to see him leave, but I knew he had to go. John promised he would be back, and that I should wait for him. After John left, I decided to settle back in our town. I eventually took my parents' advice on stability. I didn't want to move around too much, and my parents were already old, so taking care of our bookstore was not easy for them, so I just took over and expanded it into a library bookstore where even students from the college I graduated from came to my bookstore. The first few months that John was away, we talked almost every time, and he was always telling me how hard it was out there for him and how he had to learn to adjust to everything in a different state. And I kept encouraging him and keeping him updated on everything that went on too, where I was. Eventually, John got the hang of things, and he started making lots of friends in the program, and he looked happier. When it was a month before his 1-year stay at the place, I was excited I would have John back, and I even started planning a welcome back party for him. But John then told me that he had to stay an extra year before he could come back, because he had another opportunity to. I was so sad and heartbroken. I felt hurt, but I didn't want to seem like I was against his progress, so I smiled and told him how happy I was for him. I prepared my mind to wait for John for another year before he came back. It took John 4 years to come back, and within those 4 years, he managed to write and publish 6 best-selling books, and I was so proud of him. Also, within those 4 years, even though I had suitors come after me, I was very faithful to John because I loved him despite the distance between us. In fact, one time, a man named Stephen proposed to me publicly in front of even the students that patronized my bookstore when I refused to pay him any attention. He didn't propose marriage, but he publicly declared his intentions to go on a date with me because he was in love with me. I had to accept his offer for the date because I didn't know how to say no, especially in public, and disgrace the man. That was one negative thing about myself, not being able to refuse to do something even if it wasn't convenient for me to do. I just couldn't say no to people, and that is one factor why my marriage has failed. I went on the date with the man with just one intention, to tell him why I had agreed to the date and tell him I had a boyfriend that I was waiting for. Stephen mocked me, saying that John might even probably be married with a kid on the way over there, and I was there hoping he was waiting like I was. I was hurt by the words he said, not because of how he said them, but because I started to think about them, and the fear and doubt started growing in my mind. I started becoming paranoid and would call randomly, and when he probably wasn't there with his phone to pick my calls, I panicked and would start to think he was with another woman. I would stylishly ask him questions about the women there, and since John knew me completely, he would laugh and tease me because he knew why I was asking. That only made the feeling of doubts grow more, and I just couldn't bear them. When John published his first book, I was so happy, and he emailed me a copy. The book was dedicated to his love awaiting love, which was me, and I was so happy. The book sold the most, and I ordered the first 100 copies, and because students liked the book so much, I had to order another 300, which sold out within a week. I was so happy because my boyfriend had started becoming so popular, and when he released his second book, I was also the first to receive the book, personally autographed by John and signed to his forever love. He did the same with the other 4 books, and then he decided to come back home. His coming home had been a surprise to me because he hadn't mentioned anything about it to me. He had only been hinting that he would come, but I hadn't even been wishing he did because he had promised me that the other last 3 years, so I had been expecting that year to be the same thing. But John had surprised me by showing up at my parents' bookshop that I managed. That day, my head had been stuck in a book per usual. It was his 6th book, and I was rereading it for the umpteenth time, and my concentration level had been at 100. He had come and had asked who the author of the book I was reading was, and I had raised my head thinking it was a customer who had walked in. The shock, then the screams, and the hugs and kisses all over his face came in order. People had watched me with him, and they were all surprised that I was with the popular writer and had been kissing him like a starved puppy. I had been so happy that I cried tears of joy, especially when he handed me a flower after I had finished my kiss assault on his face. Then he went down on one knee and somehow produced a box from his other hand that I hadn't even noticed before and asked me the million-dollar question. I had screamed my answer before diving into his arms again. I had been so happy that I got to be with the man of my dreams. Everyone had been so much happier for us. We had gotten married in the local church in our town, and the church had the highest population that day, with people who weren't even invited coming. Even some reporters came. I had been sure it was to get the picture for their paper, and yes, the next day the papers had printed, "Famous writer marries his high school sweetheart." I wasn't exactly pleased when I saw it. They only said a few lines about me in the paper, and everything else just complimented John. I shrugged it off then. He was the famous one. I wasn't. So, a few weeks after our wedding, John suggested we move out of our town and move to the apartment he had gotten in one of the biggest towns. I had been surprised and unhappy about it, because John never told me he had bought an apartment before that day, and I had thought we were going to settle in our town like our parents did. But I had figured it didn't exactly suit his new appearance to be seen living in a local town, so I agreed to move with him. We employed someone to stay at the bookstore, and within 2 weeks, I had successfully uprooted my life away from everything I had always known. The first 3 months had been amazing because John knew I hadn't been comfortable moving, so he made sure he helped me settle in by being there. He would take me to expensive restaurants, buy me gifts, and we would go on dates to famous places as mapped by Google and take tours around those places. Soon enough, I had begun to slowly adjust to the place until I meant John, had been invited to an event, and I had gone with him. It had been the first event he had been formally invited to after coming back from the States, so I had been quite nervous, and I had wanted to impress people as his wife. I had the biggest difficulty choosing a dress because I had never had to worry about these things. The only parties I had ever felt necessary to go to were the parties in our town, and I hadn't needed to bother too much about what I had to wear because I was usually the one helping and running the party. I had eventually chosen a dress because it was dark purple, my favorite color, and it had matched the theme of the party. Since I wasn't a girl that was good with makeup, I had just done my hair and applied lip gloss. When we arrived at the party, I had felt so underdressed in comparison to the women there, and I felt so out of place because everyone wanted to talk to my husband, but not me. I felt insignificant because I was just the wife. No one asked or even remembered my name. In fact, the only person that did talk to me asked me what I did, and when I told her I managed a bookstore, her response made me feel very bad. She had responded with an "oh," and then she moved on to speak to another person, probably someone that had a significant job. I literally counted the time until we left, and when we had gotten home, John had so much to say about the party and the important people he spoke to. He was excited, and I didn't share his enthusiasm, but when I complained about what the people did to me, John had just shrugged it off as nothing, and had even said I probably just felt that way because I wasn't used to things or people like that. I had been so upset that John thought that my reaction to the party was because I had never attended one, but I kept quiet about it. 3 years into our marriage, we still weren't pregnant, and I was wondering what was wrong. I wanted to be pregnant. In fact, I was desperate to be pregnant. Not only because of the town's prejudice, but because I knew that my mom, at my age, was already pregnant with me, and I've always promised myself that since she only had me, I would give her lots of grandchildren to play with, at least 4. Despite that, I loved kids, and I've always dreamed of carrying mine and how spoiled they would be with lots of love like I had growing up. I convinced John to come with me to a fertility clinic, and he reluctantly agreed after I had already gone on 2 visits on my own, and I was tested and confirmed to be fine. When he eventually agreed to come with me and was tested, we found out that he had a sexually transmitted disease that he didn't treat over the years, or probably took unprescribed medication, and it had definitely affected his sperm, so we could not have kids. I was so angry and horrified because that meant John cheated on me, but John swore that he never did cheat on me and told me it was probably the first girl he had sex with, and it was just a one-time thing, and they didn't even date. He had wanted to level up with his friends, and being the only virgin in that clique made him the one being teased. So he had just had one unprotected sex with the girl, and he never did try again until me. When he noticed he had a sexually transmitted disease, he had told one of his friends, who just gave him a drug, and he used it. And because he was fine, he didn't bother to check again. The doctor had advised he start proper medications, and it was a 50-50 chance of us having kids. For the next 2 years, we tried everything, but nothing worked. We couldn't have any kids, and I never seized every opportunity to remind John that he was the cause of our problem and how hard I'm sacrificing my youth for him. Instead of already having my second baby, I was with him and having none. I made sure that he knew that every chance I got. One time, he had written a book, and the book had yet again become a best-selling book, and he was called up to be given an award for best-selling author. I was very angry, and I told him that he was going to get some award and congratulations on some stupid book while I was there, hoping and praying desperately for a child. I even told him how lucky he was that I loved him, because I wouldn't even be in his house, still waiting and hoping the medications eventually kicked in, and he managed to get me pregnant. He was so sad that he eventually did not go to the event and just went to his friend's place and spent the night. When he had come back home, I still did not apologize, because at those moments, I felt like it was him punishing me for his mistakes, because I was the one getting asked by our parents when a baby was coming, and it was hurting me knowing that a baby might never even come. One time, I had suggested adoption, and John had reluctantly agreed, because I had again reminded him of why we did not have kids of our own. We processed everything, but yet the adoption process fell through, and I remember that I had cried myself to sleep that night, and when John tried to comfort me, I had slapped his hand away and cursed at him, reminding him yet again that he was the cause of the problem we had. Well, fortunately I got pregnant in our 6th year of marriage, and I was just so happy, but that happiness was cut short as I miscarried during the first month of being pregnant. I got pregnant 2 months after that, and I still miscarried again. It was discovered that my womb could not carry a child to full term. I was so unhappy, but John was always beside me, comforting me and not blaming me for anything. After 2 more years of trying and failing to carry a baby successfully, John then suggested we try finding a surrogate to help us carry our child, and I refused because I wanted to have the experience of carrying my own child in my womb. I continued to try to get pregnant, and I was miscarrying each time, and eventually I stopped getting pregnant. I was miserable and unhappy, and John tried everything to make me happy, but I just wasn't. Eventually, John decided we should move back to our hometown, thinking that seeing our parents and everyone I was familiar with would cheer me up again. We moved to the house we had bought some years back, so that any time we came around, we didn't have to stay with our parents, but have a place to come back to. I was still unhappy, and somehow I just managed to still flip everything in my head to be John's fault. I had believed that if he hadn't gotten a sexually transmitted disease through unprotected sex, I would have gotten pregnant earlier in our marriage, and it wouldn't be now that my body kept rejecting a baby. John bore my nasty, stupid nags and never said anything or blamed me. I resumed watching over my parents' bookstore, and it was then I met George. George had just moved into our town, and he was a widowed husband whose wife, before dying of cancer, gave him no child. It was only after her death he discovered that she had a surgery in the past that had complications, and because of that, she couldn't have children. I got close to George because I felt we were in the same situation, and because I felt he understood me better. George started a small farming business in our town, and despite the fact that I knew nothing about farming, I would leave the bookstore and go over to his place and ask questions like, I was interested in farming just so I could hear him speak. He was just brilliant, and he had this slightly different accent that amused me. I felt like he was heartbroken, and we were 2 peas in a pod, because I was heartbroken too, and due to the same cause, no children of our own. I was starting to develop feelings for George, and even though I knew I loved John very much, I still couldn't help myself. I wanted to be spending time with George more and more, and of course my parents and literally the whole town noticed my newfound friendship with George. My parents called me over to their place and warned me to stay away from him because, even though there was nothing between us, the town wouldn't think so, and definitely, my husband would not think so. I ignored their advice and continued seeing George. John asked me to stay clear of him or stop going over to his place to see him, and I got defensive and told him that we were only friends, and that if I had any children of my own, I probably wouldn't have been such a jobless friendship seeker. John had kept quiet after that, and I was happy back then, not knowing I was rejoicing in my foolishness. I would sometimes stay with George at his house, and we would talk into the evenings, and I would even cook his dinner. Sometimes I would bring him breakfast and lunch when I cooked at my own place. Eventually, the feelings I had for George grew, and I started having sexual dreams about him. I would purposely go to his farm early in the morning because I knew that was when he worked, and I would watch him from afar when he worked shirtless. I had even stopped having sex with John because I felt he wasn't even man enough to get me pregnant. So what was the use? I had known that George was not interested in me as a woman, but only as a friend, and that he knew I was married. But that made me all the more desperate to want to have him look at me like a woman. I started wondering what it would be like just spending the night in George's arms instead of John's, and that would usually keep me awake at night and very sexually stimulated too. I knew I was in trouble the way I was acting, and I tried to stay away from George, but I just couldn't help myself. So I thought to myself, I know how crazy I sound now, that if I could interest George in a one-time affair with me, that maybe I would be able to get him out of my system and focus on my marriage. I know how stupid I am now to have had thoughts like that, but I honestly thought I was in love with George. But I actually wasn't. I was just infatuated, and I was there thinking it was love. So I eventually got my chance. I had cooked George a meal as usual, and I had seduced him into bed. After the whole thing, George was regretful, but I assured him that it was nothing, and since it wouldn't happen again, he didn't need to worry. Well, it did happen again and again. I continued sleeping with George. Then I knew that I wasn't in love with him, but I was just doing the whole thing because I was in lust. John, on the other hand, did not behave like he suspected anything. One time, because I knew that John didn't know any of my friends from college physically, he only knew them because I had mentioned their names in our conversations, I lied to him that Mara, a friend from college whom I usually talked about, had given birth, and I wanted to go see her and her new baby. Mara was in another state entirely, and we had already lost contact, so I didn't even know if she was married or with kids or not because we hadn't spoken since we left college. But my husband didn't know that, obviously, so I lied, and he believed me, and I told him I'd be gone for 2 days. Meanwhile, I had planned a trip with George, and so it wouldn't be suspicious. I had asked him to leave a day before me, and when we ended our little vacation, I'd come back to town before he did. George had left a day earlier as planned, and then I packed my things and went to join him. We were like two birds set free from their cages. We had breakfast and lunch from the hotel, and we usually had dinner outside the hotel. After the whole days of being with each other, we came back to town as planned, with a day's difference to avoid suspicion. And we continued our affair behind my husband's back, without exactly reasoning the consequences of my actions. One time, Martha had grabbed my shoulders and told me she knew what I was doing, and I had better stop before it was too late. Well, you see, Martha is the old lady that nobody in that town spoke to. Even new people in town were told what she had done and why they should avoid her. Martha had been caught cheating on her husband with his brother, and her husband, in his attempt to drive out of town in anger, had been met with an accident, and he had died instantly. And when the brother heard what had happened, he ran away with all of Martha's and her husband's savings, leaving Martha behind to bear the consequences of their actions and with no money. Since then, for over 30 years, nobody spoke to her, and I heard she had said one time that she stayed back all those years with the people that hated her so much, so she could be reminded every day of the consequences of her actions. So when she grabbed me and told me that, I had been scared and quickly left her. I knew she couldn't tell anyone, even if she did know about my affair with George, because no one gave her listening ears. So I ignored her advice and continued down my path of self-destruction. Martha's story and the life she lived was clearly enough of a lesson for me to learn from, but I had stupidly thought that somehow it wouldn't happen to me because I was smart, not knowing I was the dumbest person alive. Well, what they say about reaping and sowing is true, because no matter how hard you try to change the result of what you planted, you're still going to get the result of exactly what you did plant. That fateful day, I had gone to George's place as usual after lying to John that I had to pick up a book delivery. George had been up that morning, and he had been thinking. I had sneaked up behind him and hugged him, but he had removed my hands from his body like they were needles, and I had been surprised. I had asked him what was wrong, and he had told me that our affair needed to stop, and he had told me that he was leaving our town for good because he hadn't thought he would stay that long. He had told me that he didn't tell me the full truth about his wife. He told me that day that his wife wasn't dead as he had initially told me, and that she had caught him cheating and had filed for a divorce, which cost him half his wealth, and she had also gotten the house. So that was why he had come to our town, to find a cheaper place to stay in until he got the money he needed so he could afford a better apartment. I had been so shocked by what he said, and I realized that he was using me for both sexual satisfaction and also for feeding. I felt so ashamed of myself for being so stupid as to be used by him, and I had just quietly left his place, regretting why I risked my marriage for someone who wasn't even worth it. When I got home, John was there, and he asked me how the delivery went, and I replied with a fine. John then brought out a small envelope for me to look at, and I was wondering what it might be until I saw the content. It was a divorce paper, and it was already signed by one party, which was John, and I was shocked and scared and asked him why he was leaving me. He had calmly told me he had been holding on to the papers for a week, waiting for the right moment to give them to me because I had always reminded him of his mistakes and made him feel less of himself, and always told him about all the sacrifices I was making just by being married to him and not divorcing him because he couldn't give me a child. Even though, when he eventually could, my body decided not to carry a child, I still somehow made it his fault and was always nagging about it. I started pleading with John to forgive me and give me a chance to make amends, but the next thing John said finalized everything. He had said, "I know about your affair." I couldn't even ask how he found out because I couldn't even speak after he said that. He just stood up, packed his bags, and he left. I mean, totally left. He left town and left me. Guys, please, I know how stupid this may sound, but I am really desperate and can't afford to lose John. Please help me. Update. Hello, Reddit. Maybe this would have been a different thing if I had done it for money, but I hadn't even done it for money. I hadn't even done it because George was as handsome as John was. I hadn't done it because John was cheating on me, and it was some sort of revenge plot against him. I hadn't done it to even get the child I desperately wanted, and because of that, I insulted my husband. No, I had no valid reason for cheating, and that is what makes me such a stupid person, as I'm sure most of you agree, as you've expressed in many words in the comments. Funnily, I cannot even say that I don't deserve such comments, because I know I had everything that's happening to me now coming. I lost my marriage of 10 whole years over something as fleeting as lust. I lost the man that loved me so much over something as fleeting as temporal pleasure. I feel so stupid. I should have listened to Martha and stopped. I should have never even started in the first place because the consequences were right in front of me, and I still chose that over the bliss of staying married. I've hurt John with not only my words and actions, but I defiled our sacred vows on the altar. How stupid can one get past that? John has left town, and somehow everyone in town knew about the divorce and my affair with George, and I'm now exactly like Martha, who no one wanted anything to do with, including my own family. Even Martha saw me across the street the other day, and looked at me in disgust before walking her way. I probably reminded her of her younger self, who was too stupid to see that actions had consequences. George had also left town, probably moving to the next victim of his, but I wasn't even exactly a victim. He left me to bear the weight of my sins alone. I have no one to speak to. I'm utterly alone and miserable. I regret every moment of what I did to John. I have realized that even before I started cheating on him with George, I had already started cheating way long before that. When I found out he couldn't give me kids, my always trying to make him feel guilty for our childlessness, my always making him feel less of a man for a mistake that happened long before we even ever dated, my always trying to let him know how much of a sacrifice I was making staying married to him. And later, when it wasn't even his fault again, I still managed to spin the whole thing to look like it was. Words cannot fully express how horrible I feel at this moment. I've discovered that it's so easy for tears to flow, even now as I write this. I deserve this. I had it coming when I tried to replace a good man with a bad one. I cannot believe I could ever believe that George could be half the man that John is. I just cannot know what influenced my decision or say why I did what I did, but the consequences just are right after. I wish so badly that I hadn't cheated on John like I did, or that I hadn't been so stupid to nag him so much about his mistakes. I wish I had been an understanding wife to him. I wish I had honored our wedding vows for better or worse. But life doesn't offer do-overs, and so I'm stuck alone all by myself, wishing I could, but knowing I can't. I lost the best man for me, the one person that could take all of my foolishness and still loved me all those years of being married, and I pushed him so hard to a point that he eventually just had to leave. I know that if I were another person in John's shoes, I would have left me too, and I definitely would not have stayed as long as he did with me. The stares and loud whispers when I walk in the streets have me scurrying back into my now very empty home without John as fast as I can. My parents wouldn't even let me near their bookstore, as they closed it down and sold the place to a person who opened a coffee shop. Even the place that I had termed my sanctuary, where I could lose myself in stories for hours and forget about my life, was gone. I'm left to stare all day at every piece of furniture in my house, which had even become hard because they all reminded me of John, as he was the one who chose the furniture for the house. John was the best man for me, and I lost him due to my own foolishness and reckless actions. It's hard. It's so hard waking up every day with the same memories of what you could have had and what you so stupidly lost. It's so very hard. Update. Hello Reddit, this is regrettably my last post here. Thank you all for at least reading my story. Your harsh comments were more welcome than the silent and cold treatment I get from everybody around me now. I know I can never forgive myself for what I did to John, and I will forever live with the regrets of knowing what I had and lost. Just wanted to tell you guys not to make the same mistakes I made. Believe me when I say I'd rather be happy and childless in John's arms right now than be the lonely, wretched hag I am right now. Thanks and goodbye.